We're now moving into the main part of this afternoon's event, which is a symposium on the theme of exploring the past, present and future of the science of agriculture. And we very much hope that this might stimulate some new Anglo-Japanese research collaborations through UEA, and we also wanted to take this as an opportunity to celebrate some existing research partnerships. And it's as I said earlier, it's a very great pleasure, very honour to have some of our most distinguished research collaborators between Japan and UK here with us this afternoon. Just before I begin my presentation, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank in particular my colleague Dr. Shinya Shoda, who I'm going to introduce in a couple of minutes, because without the assistance of the Nara National Research Institute for Cultural Properties, which was brokered by Dr. Shoda, we wouldn't have been able to use this wonderful facility that we're in today. I also want to thank my colleague, Professor Kaifu Yusuke, who unfortunately can't be with us this afternoon. Professor Kaifu is one of the curatorial research scientists here at the National Museum for Nature and Science. Today he's actually in Sendai installing a new exhibition about something which is close to my heart, about rock art from the Dordogne in France, which is an exhibition which started here and is now travelling all around the country. I'd like to thank my colleagues who can't be here, who are in Norwich from the Centre for Japanese Studies. In particular, this is Natsue Hayward, who has worked tirelessly to make sure that all of the materials that you have today, and in this brochure, you have Japanese abstracts for the talks today, and you also have in this document the English abstracts. So I hope that gives you sufficient to be able to follow the content that's going to be presented. And I'd also like to thank our colleagues from the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures. We have the Executive Director with us today, Mami Mizutori, and we also have Keiko Nishioka and Hiromi Uchida, who are helping out with the logistics today. Now, one of the founding precepts of the University of East Anglia is interdisciplinarity. I am an archaeologist. I work mainly in Japanese prehistory, and I've always felt that archaeology is one of the most interdisciplinary subjects that one can indulge in. I've been very fortunate over the years to be able to work in Japan with Japanese colleagues here since 1984. I think it was the first time I came to Japan as an undergraduate student, speaking no Japanese, and my only encounter with Japanese archaeology was through books and slides that were presented in lectures. And I still remember coming to Tokyo, cherry blossom time, being amazed by everybody out in Ueno Park, enjoying the cherry blossoms, and then also have my first encounter with real Japanese archaeological material in the Tokyo National Museum, which is, of course, just on the other side of Ueno Park here. I've been very fortunate to be able to follow that interest over the years, and it's particularly pleasing now, through both the Sainsbury Institute and the University of East Anglia, to be able to introduce new generations of students to both Japanese archaeology and also to British archaeology. And one of the main things I found with this is that the study of a very different archaeological sequence, and what we have in Japan is completely different to what we used to in Europe, can bring very new insights into material that seems very familiar to us closer to home. And over the years, many of my projects have ended up being comparative in nature. And it's going to be one of those projects in particular that I'm talking about today. And that's on the notion of the agricultural revolution. It's a key concept in archaeology. Every first year archaeology student has to grapple with this one way or the other. In 2012, just after we had established our new Japanese language degree programs at the University of East Anglia, and just a year after the terrible disaster that struck the north coast of Japan in March 2011, I was involved in organising a conference at Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto on the origins of agriculture. This project in itself grew out of preceding collaborations, and it was my colleague Professor Yano Kenichi, who sadly can't be here today, who had come and spent time with us in Norwich and in Cambridge for a year as a visiting scholar. When he came back to Ritsumeikan, he said he really wanted to bring together for the first time the leading specialists in the question of the origins of agriculture to Kyoto to be able to put some of the Japanese archaeological record in a global perspective. And here are the scholars that gathered at Ritsumeikan in March, 6 years ago, 5 years ago now. That project is now coming to fruition, and it's a wonderful pleasure to have Ms. Chino Hasabe with us this afternoon, because we are going to be launching a new series of publications with Springer on the science of the history of humanity in Asia and the Pacific, with a volume that arises from this conference that took place in 2012. And that's going to be the book on the right, which will be out later this year. Over the last few days, we've had the privilege of guiding our Vice Chancellor and President around some Japanese landscapes. And yesterday, the day before yesterday, we were in Munakata, in Kyushu, and we drove through many landscapes filled with rice paddies. And indeed, coming from outside Japan, one's first experience of the Japanese rural environment is of rice paddies. And of course, at this time of year, they're particularly enchanting because they're full of water, and if you wander around in the evening, they're often full of fireflies. It's as if they've always been here. They've become completely incorporated as a natural part of the Japanese landscape. But they are anything but natural. They are a major human intervention in the natural environment. Many British archaeologists who are used to dealing with plough-damaged archaeological sites find it hard to believe that in Japan you have to construct your field before you can grow any crops in it. You have to remove the topsoil, you have to lay down a thick paddy base, then you can put the topsoil back, and that is the way you can retain the water that is necessary for growing japonica rice, which needs to be transplanted into water. In the present context of massive rural depopulation in Japan and a rapidly aging population, there are not enough people to maintain these spectacular landscapes across the archipelago. Here is a particularly fine example from the Noto Peninsula in Ishikawa Prefecture. These terraced rice paddies leading down to the Sea of Japan, would evoke in many of my Japanese colleagues, yes, that is quintessentially a bit of Japanese landscape. But look at them. They are tiny. They're too small to bring machines into. The only way to transplant rice seedlings in these landscapes is the back-breaking work of bending over and individually putting the rice seedlings in, and given the option of that, or a lifestyle in Tokyo, where you can have good jobs, good salaries, work 9 to 5, and not be troubled by the mosquitoes and the other creatures that live in the paddies. It's an obvious choice for many young Japanese people. This is a challenge that we're starting to see across Asia, across regions where rice is grown, to the extent to which many of these landscapes are now regarded as being endangered. And UNESCO has now identified globally important agricultural heritage systems, including rice paddies such as these, and I would recognise them as part of our archaeological record that we have to work hard to sustain. Now, as an archaeologist, I would argue that anybody who uses that word for what they do in the later 20th and 21st centuries, we have to be able to understand some of the science behind the analyses that we undertake. When I first came to Japan in 1984, my role was to undertake phosphate analysis of soil samples from a series of cores we were taking across the Nara Basin in central Japan, in the old capital area of the Kinai. We were looking for ancient paddy fields. We know that rice was introduced to Japan. We now know that it happened around about 900 BC, getting on to 3,000 years ago. We had never found any actual rice paddies in the Nara Basin at that time. I still remember the flight on Philippine Airlines. It was the stopping service, and we stopped at least 6 times on our way from London to Tokyo and passed through various climatic zones. It was snowing when we left London, it was 85 degrees in Manila, and it was snowing again when we landed at Narita Airport. A naive third-year student, I thought there was no problem bringing little plastic bags full of white powder that were necessary for phosphate analysis in my suitcase from London to Japan. Unfortunately, nobody opened the suitcase en route to see what was in there. From the cores, I did find heightened levels of phosphate, which suggested that we had identified earlier layers of human activity in the Nara Basin. At the 2012 conference on the origins of agriculture, Mr. Okada Kenichi, one of the senior researchers from the Kashihara Archaeological Institute in Nara, showed these slides. These are the results of archaeological excavations undertaken over a wide area of the Nara Basin, including areas where we had done some of our coring, which showed the extent of some of the earliest paddy fields in that part of Japan, dating to about 500 BC. They were there. Very often in archaeology, the first stage is just to find a few traces, and then that will be followed up with major investigations later on. This is thanks to building a new expressway through the Nara Basin, a new motorway, and in Japan, as in Britain, developers bear the costs of archaeological investigations to record the important remains that are going to be destroyed in the course of their development. The debate over the distinction between nature and culture, the wild and the domesticated, has very ancient roots in both British and European and Japanese anthropology and archaeology. Herbert Spencer is perhaps at the beginning of this process, identifying ideas that are familiar to environmentalists and ecologists today. And he in turn drew on thinking from the 19th century, perhaps embodied by the work of Christian Jørgensen Thomsen, the famous Dane, who first created the so-called 3-age system, which divided the material past of humanity into 3 technological ages: the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. It was John Lubbock, later Lord Avebury, in his Prehistoric Times, as illustrated by ancient remains, published in 1865, who first identified the difference between the Old Stone Age and the New Stone Age. And it was a technological difference which he identified as lying in the appearance of polished stone tools as opposed to chipped stone tools. This was then picked up by anthropologists who were looking at ideas of social evolution. as humanity passed through a number of identified stages of development. From a savage stage of hunter-gatherers, collectors of berries and fruits, through a second stage of herdsmen or nomads living in close contact with animals, and a third stage where human beings domesticated plants and animals to become agriculturalists, to become farmers. But it was perhaps the work of this man, Vere Gordon Child, the renowned Australian archaeologist who was to become director of the Institute of Archaeology at the University of London, and then the Abercrombie Professor of Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh, who in the 20th century set out his ideas of the Neolithic Revolution and subsequently the Urban Revolution, seeing how human beings moved from hunting and gathering to farming, and from living in small-scale village communities to living in proper urban communities. And we are arguably still in the middle of both of those revolutions. Only in recent years have more than 50% of humanity come to live in cities. And with the increasing interest in wild foods, encapsulated in restaurants such as Noma in Denmark, where the chefs go out every morning to forage for their incredibly expensive ingredients, we know that even as a farmer, people are still very much dependent on the wild resources that are available in nature, suggesting that the boundary between non-agricultural and agricultural communities is more permeable than perhaps Gordon Child would have recognised. And today, I think it's perhaps worth thinking that we're moving from simple processes, such as the spread of rice farming, big themes, big questions that I had to write undergraduate essays on many years ago, towards a more historical approach, where we now have a high-resolution archaeological database which we can analyse in terms of occupational histories backed up by very detailed radiocarbon dates. We're perhaps moving from an archaeology of prehistoric peoples, trying to identify certain groups, ethnic groups, as farmers or foragers, to types of people. We now have prehistories that focus on gender differences, men and women, children and the elderly, moving away from more essentialising narratives about the cultural discourse. And we're moving away from models which try to identify the nature of particular periods, for example the Jomon or the Yayoi, the Mesolithic or the Neolithic, to try to understand the change between those periods. And some of the ideas that we're working with around metastable environments and non-equilibrium ecosystems that I know are familiar to many of our colleagues here today. I now want to just give you a few examples of the work that we're doing, that we've been doing here in Japan, always in collaboration with our Japanese research partners. And here we have a map showing, it was drawn as the development of early farming sites in Korea and Japan. It's a little old now, it's 2006, and I know that Dr. Shoda is going to have some more up-to-date information for us. I'm going to talk about a couple of sites in particular, the areas where I'm working on the Japan Sea coast of Honshu, along the Shinano River. I'm going to talk a little bit about the site of Toro, which is a very important site for these studies. A number of Western archaeologists have written on these topics. Gary Crawford was perhaps the first person to introduce systematic sampling for paleobotanical samples from prehistoric sites across northern Japan, and he has written extensively on the nature of the transition to agriculture in the Japanese archipelago, as well as in Korea and China. Gary Crawford makes very cogent arguments. We've misidentified agriculture in Japan, and we've always associated it with rice farming. whereas in fact there's a whole range of cultigens, and we're hearing currently about beans and many starchy plants, which may well have been domesticated here as well. An old friend of mine is Mark Hudson, Professor Mark Hudson, now at the Mount Fuji Research Institute in Shizuoka Prefecture. Published a wonderful book called The Ruins of Identity back in 1998, where he tried to draw together ideas about the development of agricultural society in Japan with what he called the development of ethnogenesis, the appearance of the Japanese people. And he related early farming to the development of the Japanese language, and he also looked at the biological anthropology of prehistoric Japanese peoples to develop a model combining biological, linguistic, and archaeological data to reassess notions of invasion and diffusion and immigration. More recently, Professor Mizoguchi Koji of the University of Kyushu, again an old friend, a tremendous collaborator, we edit the Japanese Journal of Archaeology together these days, has divided the Japanese archaeological sequence into more of an experiential type of prehistory, identifying particular traits from the Jomon, Yayoi, and early historical periods. And most recently, back in 2015, as part of the Cambridge University Press series of the History of the World, along with Professor Yao Kenichi, my collaborator from Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, we were able to put together models that demonstrate the seasonality behind both hunting and gathering in the Jomon period and agriculture in the Yayoi period, emphasizing the diversity of resources, in particular wild resources that were being exploited and continue to be exploited in Japan today. Back to our maps. The site of Toro is just here. In 1948, the Japanese Archaeological Association undertook excavations at the site of Toro, which is in Shizuoka Prefecture, within sight of Mount Fuji. It was on the site of an old aeroplane factory that had been used in the Second World War, and the archaeologists were working in a context where a post-war context in which Japanese early history had been wiped out by the occupying forces. Until 1945, the authorized version of Japanese history, early Japanese history, was one written down in two 8th century books called the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, which talked about the gods who created the Japanese archipelago and gave a history of the imperial Yamato dynasty. And that was the authorized version of Japanese history, which the occupying forces insisted were obliterated from the school textbooks that history teachers were using to teach in Japanese schools. Archaeology stepped into the breach, and through a coordinated program of excavations at sites such as Toro, for the first time were able to cast light on prehistoric agricultural communities in Japan. They found the first ancient rice paddies and the first ancient houses that were re-excavated, and you can still visit the Toro Historical Park today. 12 houses were discovered, storage buildings, which seem to be the archetypes for Japanese shrine architecture, 30 plots of rice paddies, scattered over an area of some 8 hectares, very important early agricultural landscape, with domesticates including millet, gourd, melon, peach, and animals including cow, deer, boar, the tanuki, raccoon dog, and lots of fish. Not only rice, by any means. Moving to my own research area on the Sea of Japan coast, since 2004 we've been involved in a long-term study of landscape change along the longest river system of the Japanese archipelago, the Shinano and Chikuma rivers, which flow through Niigata and Nagano prefectures. And this is work that we're undertaking with the Niigata Prefectural Museum of History, And indeed, the day after tomorrow, we're taking our Vice Chancellor to visit Nagoga so we can see some of this firsthand. Here's the Shinano River, and here's some different landscape further inland in Mount Yatsutake. They're all landscapes which we've been studying. And with the help of this very high-resolution archaeological database that we have already here in Japan, we're able to look at settlement patterns and occupational histories, the way that human settlement across this landscape has changed from the first occupation some 30,000 years ago until today, using the wonders of geographical information systems. Looking at some of the architectural evidence, we're able to get a good handle over the occupational histories of some of these sites. And so with art starting to build up long-term historical patterns of how they're first occupied, continued and abandoned, and the environmental pressures on those sites, and the impact that the occupation of those sites have on those landscapes. We've been employing a few scientific techniques of our own. Soil micromorphology, looking at the structure of the soils from these buildings and midden areas in detail, starts to give us a micro-history of how these sites are built up. When fires took place, when soils are piled up, when soils are moved around. We've also been doing a lot of work on the ceramics. And one of the big mysteries of the middle part of our sequence is why pots suddenly start to have lids on them. We have flame pots in the early stage here, and then lidded vessels just behind. And this is leading us to try and look at prehistoric culinary practices, as well as the farming and collecting practices around them. There are extraordinary waterlogged sites out in the Niigata Plain. The Aota site was discovered again in advance of motorway construction in the early years of this century, and buried some 5 meters beneath the current ground surface. The preservation conditions were extraordinary. The immediate comparator here are the prehistoric Swiss Lake Village sites that some of you may be familiar with. We have extraordinary levels of preservation, basketry, pits full of nuts, as fresh as the day they were picked 2,000 years ago. We have architectural members, we have the dugout canoes and the lacquer through which this wetland landscape was exploited. We have deeply buried paddy field sites from central mountain basins in Nagano Prefecture, Sasakawa. Here are remains of ancient paddy fields again, some 5 meters beneath the current ground surface. Some of these sites are throwing up evidence for rice much earlier than we would expect. AMS dates from this site in northern Japan come in about 900 BC, which is several decades earlier than we would expect to be finding them there. But we also find early paddy fields in the north of Japan. Relatively short-lived. Perhaps these are some early pioneers who are making their way up to Aomori Prefecture in the northern tip of Honshu, that they're not able to keep growing rice for very long periods. They're pioneer settlements that may be ultimately unsuccessful. Some of these landscapes are landscapes of disaster, and this was very much brought home to me in 2011 when I was here in Tokyo when the terrible Great East Japan earthquake struck, the biggest earthquake in 1,000 years, which led to the terrible tsunami wave which killed so many people in March 2011. There are earlier examples of tsunamis like this. This is a site called Kutsukata in the Sendai Plain, and the white, these are paddy fields from about 2,000 years ago, and the white, it's about 3 kilometers inland. The white, you can see there, marine sands that have been deposited by a tsunami wave that's coming. And we then know that people went back and rebuilt their paddies after that. You can see that in the stratigraphy of the site. My own study area in the Shinano River, in 2004, there was a major earthquake, for the first time derailed the Shinkansen, the bullet train, on its way to Niigata. One the epicenter of the Great Shueitsu earthquake was a small village called Yamakoshi, famous for bullfighting since the 16th century, and also famous for its nishikoi carp growing, as well as rice. It was completely obliterated in 2004. When I visited in 2015, those landscapes had been completely restored at great expense, drawing on the records that had been made of those previous agricultural systems that we started out with, demonstrating the tremendous resilience of these agricultural systems in the face of the very active environmental conditions that we have here in Japan. There are now a series of memorials where you can visit to experience the impact of that earthquake for yourself. And some of the work that we've been doing is visiting places like this, which are Michi-no-eki. They are roadside stations where local produce is being sold by local farmers, and we've been trying to model what the patterns look like before the earthquake and after the earthquake, trying to understand the resilience of these small-scale, local productive systems. And these are the distributions of these Michi-no-eki you find all around Japan today. In my abstract, I wrote that there is a concern that for many people in the modern world, especially as we all live in cities, we are increasingly removed from food production and agriculture and farming, to the extent that probably many children are unaware of where food comes from. Surely it comes from the local konbini, where it comes out of the packaging. We feel at the Sainsbury Institute that engaging the public in our research is of great importance, and we do that both in Japan and in the UK. And we feel there's a great opportunity coming up in 2020 with the Tokyo Olympics to again raise the profile of what is happening with Japanese archaeology and the scientific research which is underpinning it. And we're working using new media, using this is an online resource about Japanese archaeology and cultural heritage for use in schools, to try and encourage more people to take an interest in this and to learn from lessons of the past, to think about how we can be more resilient in the future. Thank you very much.